Coeur Country, Idaho, autumn 1894. The sound was wrong. In a valley where the air carried the rhythmic thud of axes into pine and the rasp of crosscut saws, this new sound was a violent metallic punctuation, a sharp, ringing clang that echoed off the granite hillsides and made men pause, looking up the trail toward the Pengelly claim. Up there, the Cornishman, Trevenen Pengelly, was building his family's winter shelter, and everyone in the valley thought he had gone stark, raving mad. He wasn't building with logs. He wasn't even building with milled lumber from the new steam-powered sawmill down by the lake. On his cleared patch of land sat two enormous iron cylinders, each 10 feet in diameter and 20 feet long, looking like gargantuan, fallen smokestacks. They were boilerplates, hauled up the mountain on groaning wagons at ruinous expense. Pengelly, a man as quiet and solid as the granite he worked on, was painstakingly riveting them together, plate by overlapping plate, with a small hand forge and the help of his eldest son. Asher Fenimore, the assay clerk for the mining syndicate, stood with a group of men by the company store, squinting up the slope. Fenimore was a man of numbers and chemical reactions, a man who believed in known properties and predictable outcomes. "It's a fool's errand," he declared, not for the first time. "He's building an iron box, a sweat house. The moment that stove gets going, the inside will weep with condensation. Every blanket, every piece of clothing will be damp. In a month, it will be a coffin of rust and misery." Jedediah Stone, a logger who had put up 6 cabins in his time, nodded in agreement. "Iron draws the cold. Everyone knows that. You can't live inside a stove. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've ever seen a man do." Pengelly heard the whispers when he came to town for supplies. He saw the way the other settlers looked at his strange creation, the head shaking, the pitying glances toward his wife, Morwenna. He ignored it. He just bought his rivets, his flour, his salt, and returned to the sharp, ringing work of the hammer. The mockery lasted through September. The validation, when it came, would last for generations. What did this Cornish boiler riveter, this quiet immigrant who knew nothing of log construction, understand about the physics of a sealed envelope that the most experienced frontier builders in Idaho had tragically missed? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would change the definition of survival in the high, cold mountains of the American West. But before we see that iron home, tested by the brutal Idaho winter, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of the past, and I promise you will learn the fundamental, often ignored principles of thermodynamics that allowed pioneers to thrive. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional house you've ever seen? Trevenen Pengelly was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a farmer. He was a riveter. Born and raised in the tin mining districts of Cornwall, England, his world, from the time he was a boy, had been one of fire, iron, and immense contained pressure. He understood the secrets of a lap-riveted seam, the precise temperature at which a rivet should be heated to a cherry red, the two-man rhythm of the bucker and the hammer that created a joint stronger than the plates it held. He had spent 2 decades of his life building and repairing Cornish boilers, massive, high-pressure steam engines that powered the pumps, keeping the deep tin mines from flooding. His hands knew the heft of a 4-pound riveting hammer, the feel of a perfect seal, the unforgiving nature of a single, leaky seam under 100 pounds of steam pressure per square inch. He and his wife, Morwenna, with their 2 children, Lowen and Carenza, had come to Idaho for the promise of silver, for land of their own, for a life outside the damp, gray confines of the mining parish. They arrived in the spring of 1893 and, like everyone else, built a conventional cabin. It was a single-room structure of lodgepole pine, chinked with mud and moss. It looked sturdy. It felt solid. It was a death trap waiting for winter. Their first winter in the Coeur d'Alene was a lesson in failure. The green wood of the cabin shrank as it dried in the arid, cold air. The chinking, once tight, cracked and fell out in chunks, opening dozens of tiny fissures to the outside. The wind, a constant pressing force, found everyone. It was a living thing inside their home, a malevolent presence that made the candle flames dance and gutter, that lifted the corner of their wool blankets as they slept. The suffering was specific and relentless. The single plank door, made of green wood, warped so badly in the freeze-thaw cycles that it twisted past the jamb. Some mornings they couldn't get it open. On others, it would spring open on its own and refuse to close, leaving a 2-inch gap that Trevenen had to stuff with rags. The bacon grease from breakfast, left in its cast-iron skillet by the stove, would be set hard as a rock by the time Morwenna started preparing their midday meal. The worst, the detail that haunted Trevenen, was the lantern globes. Twice that winter, the delicate glass, warmed by the flame within, split clean down the side with a sharp crack as a sudden, super-chilled draft from a failed chink hit its surface. The temperature differential was too extreme for the material to handle. It was a perfect, tiny metaphor for their entire existence. A small bubble of warmth constantly under assault, ready to fracture at any moment. They burned through 12 cords of wood, an astonishing amount, and were still cold. The children were never without a cough. That spring, as the survivors emerged into the thaw, Trevenen walked around his failed cabin and saw it not as a builder would, but as a boilermaker. He saw the hundreds of feet of seams between each log, around the door, around the window frame. He saw a vessel that was designed to leak, and he knew, with the certainty of his trade, that he could build something better. He would not build a house. He would build a vessel, and he would treat winter not as an environment, but as a pressure to be sealed against. The conventional failure of the frontier log cabin was not a failure of material. It was a failure of assembly, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the primary enemy. The settlers believed the enemy was conductive heat loss, the cold seeping through the logs themselves. They were partially right. A 10-inch pine log has an R value of about 12.5, not insignificant. But conduction was a minor skirmish compared to the main invasion force, infiltration. Infiltration is, simply, air leakage. It is the single greatest thief of heat in a poorly constructed building. The force driving it is pressure differential, created by wind on the outside and the stack effect, the tendency of warm air to rise and escape through the ceiling, drawing cold air in through the floor, on the inside. A log cabin was a monument to infiltration. Imagine every single line where one log meets another. That's a seam. Imagine the corner joints, the window frames, the door frame. More seams. A typical 20 by 20 foot cabin could have over 800 linear feet of seams, all sealed with chinking. A mixture of mud, moss, or clay that was guaranteed to fail. It dried, it cracked, it shrunk away from the logs. The result was a structure that might have a dozen complete air changes per hour, ACH. This means that every 5 minutes, every cubic foot of warm air the stove had painstakingly heated was replaced by a cubic foot of freezing air from outside. The family was essentially living in a well-ventilated wood-burning stove, desperately trying to heat the entire state of Idaho. The constant drafts were not just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. They dramatically lowered the effective temperature, whisked moisture from the skin, and made life a perpetual battle to stay near the fire. The settlers fought back by adding more wood, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom by pouring water in faster. The problem wasn't the supply of heat, it was the integrity of the container. Trevenen Pengelly, the boilermaker, was the only man in the valley who looked at a house and thought first about the container. His plan began with a trip to the railhead, where he used a significant portion of his savings to purchase surplus quarter-inch iron plate, the kind used for making steam boilers or water tanks. The freight cost to haul it up the mountain was staggering, but he considered it a life-or-death investment. He didn't build a foundation in the traditional sense. He laid 2 parallel courses of heavy, dressed stone to serve as cradles for his cylinders. The construction was a spectacle. He laid out the plates on the ground, marking his rivet lines with chalk. He built the inner cylinder first, a perfect drum 10 feet in diameter. He heated each rivet in his small forge until it glowed. Then his son Lowen would toss it up to him with tongs. Trevenen would catch it in a bucket, snatch it out, and drive it into the pre-drilled hole. Inside the cylinder, Morwenna, or one of the older boys from a neighboring curious family, would hold a heavy bucking bar against the rivet's tail, while Trevenen, on the outside, formed a perfect rounded head with a pneumatic hammer driven by a small, noisy steam compressor he had ingeniously cobbled together. The valley echoed with the rat-a-tat-tat of the rivet gun, a sound of industry and alien progress. Asher Fenimore made another trip up the trail, this time with a more specific, technical objection. He found Pengelly inspecting a seam. "Pengelly," he began, his tone that of a man trying to reason with a lunatic, "I've been calculating. The surface area of that inner cylinder is over 600 square feet. With a family of 4 inside, breathing, cooking, you'll be putting nearly 2 gallons of water vapor into the air every day. When that vapor touches that cold iron, it will condense instantly. You're building a rainstorm in your own house. It will rot your bedding, rust your tools, and sicken your children. You are sealing them in their own breath." Trevenen wiped his brow with a greasy rag. He looked at Fenimore, then at his riveted seam, as tight and impermeable as the hull of a ship. "The iron won't be cold," he said, and turned back to his work. His minimal response only fueled the mockery. "The iron won't be cold," Fenimore repeated to the men in town, who chuckled. "The man thinks he can repeal the laws of nature with a hammer." What they didn't see was the next step. Once the inner cylinder was complete, Trevenen began constructing a second, larger cylinder around it, with a consistent 6-inch gap between the 2 iron skins. He used small iron spacers to maintain the distance. This was the masterstroke. He was building a double-walled vessel. As this outer shell was completed, he left openings at the top. Then, load by load, he began filling the 6-inch cavity between the iron walls with dry sawdust, a waste product from the sawmill that they gave away for free. He packed it down, making sure it filled every void. When both cylinders were complete and packed, he joined them in the middle with a short, timber-framed vestibule that served as an entry hall and an airlock. He built a heavy, insulated door on the outside of the vestibule and another on the inside. He cut 1 small opening for a window in each cylinder, fitting them with double panes of glass. Finally, he cut a hole for the stovepipe, sealing it with a custom-fabricated riveted iron collar. When he was done, he stood before a structure that looked like 2 black iron tanks connected by a shed. His wife, Morwenna, stood beside him. "It's not pretty, Trev," she said, her voice laced with a gentle Cornish lilt. "But if it's warm, it'll be the most beautiful house in Idaho." He just nodded. He had checked every rivet. He knew it would hold pressure. The physics behind Pengelly's iron home was both simple and decades ahead of its time. He had intuitively grasped the 3 modes of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. But most importantly, he had solved the problem of infiltration, which is a form of mass heat transfer via convection. Let's break it down. His primary innovation was creating a nearly perfect sealed air envelope, A riveted boiler is designed to hold high-pressure steam. By its very nature, it is airtight. Where a log cabin had thousands of feet of potential leaks, Pengelly's home had essentially zero. The riveted seams, properly made, were stronger and more airtight than the iron plates themselves. This single fact eliminated the problem of infiltration almost entirely. The wind could howl against the outer shell, but it couldn't get inside. There were no drafts. The air inside, once heated, stayed inside. An estimate of the air changes per hour, ACH, in his structure would likely be less than 0.5 compared to the 10 or 15 ACH of his neighbors' cabins. This represented a staggering 95% reduction in heat loss due to air leakage. But what about Asher Fenimore's intelligent objection, the condensation? This is where the double-skin design and the sawdust came in. The inner iron wall was not directly exposed to the minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside temperature. It was separated by 6 inches of sawdust. Sawdust, when dry and packed, is a surprisingly effective insulator, with an R value of about 2.2 per inch. 6 inches of sawdust provided an R value of R13. Added to the mass of the iron itself, the total wall assembly was likely around R15, superior to a solid log wall. This insulation was critical. It kept the interior surface of the inner iron wall warm. Condensation, or sweating, occurs when warm, moist air comes into contact with a surface that is below the dew point temperature. Because the inner wall of Pengelly's home was kept warm by the insulation and the stove's radiant heat, its surface temperature rarely, if ever, dropped to the dew point. The moisture generated by the family simply stayed in the air as vapor, managed by the minimal, controlled ventilation from opening a door or the draft of the stove itself. He had defeated the sweating problem not by fighting the moisture, but by warming the surface where it wanted to condense. Furthermore, the sawdust performed a secondary function. Any small amount of moisture that did manage to find its way into the wall cavity would be absorbed by the wood fibers of the sawdust, preventing it from pooling as liquid water and causing rust. The sawdust acted as a hygric buffer. Finally, there was the benefit of thermal mass and radiant heat. The heavy iron stove radiated heat, which was absorbed by the inner iron wall. This wall, in turn, radiated that heat back into the living space evenly. Living in the cylinder was like living next to a giant, gentle radiator. The heat was uniform, not concentrated in one hot spot by the fire. It was a comfortable, enveloping warmth. Pengelly had not built a house. He had built a thermos. That winter, the weather came not as a storm, but as a silent, suffocating siege. It was a phenomenon the old-timers called a bitterroot inversion. A mass of frigid, heavy Arctic air spilled over the mountains and settled into the valleys, filling them like water in a bowl. Then, a layer of warmer Pacific air slid in on top of it, acting as a lid. There was no wind, no snow, just a profound, crystalline, and lethal cold. For 11 straight days, the temperature in the valley never rose, above minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The effect on the settlement was catastrophic. The cold was so deep and so persistent that it defeated conventional cabins entirely. The constant burning of wood could not keep up with the heat loss. Men spent all their waking hours felling and bucking trees, dragging them back, and feeding them into stoves. Inside their homes, a thick layer of hoarfrost grew on the interior walls, tracing the gaps between the logs. Water barrels froze solid. Potatoes stored in cellars turned to icy rocks. Families huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, living in a perpetual twilight because the windows were opaque with ice. The air was thick with wood smoke as the entire valley desperately fed the fires. But the cold was winning. Up on the hill, the Pengelly family was living in a different world. The single small wood stove in one of the cylinders glowed with a modest fire. It consumed perhaps a quarter of the wood their neighbors were burning. Inside, the temperature was a steady 68 degrees. The air was still. The single-pane windows had a thin film of frost at the edges, but the double-paned ones were perfectly clear, offering a view of the frozen, smoke-hazed valley below. Morwenna baked bread, the smell filling the warm, circular space. The children, Lowen and Carenza, sat at the table in their shirt sleeves, reading a book. There were no drafts, no cold spots. The iron walls radiated a gentle, even warmth. The most telling detail, the one that proved the complete victory over the cold, sat on a small wooden desk. It was a pair of glass inkwells, one with black ink, one with blue, and a wooden pen. The ink was perfectly, miraculously liquid. It was a small island of normalcy in a world that had frozen solid. In the town below, every inkwell was a plug of black ice. The mining office records, the store ledgers, personal letters, all writing had ceased. The simple act of commerce and communication had been frozen out of existence. But in Trevenen Pengelly's iron house, the ink still flowed. On the 9th day of the inversion, Asher Fenimore found himself in a professional crisis. He needed to process a new set of silver ore samples that were critical for the syndicate's spring planning. The assay process required precise chemical reactions, which were highly sensitive to temperature. His office, despite a roaring fire, was barely above freezing, and the samples themselves were dangerously cold. He remembered, with a sudden flash of insight, his conversation with Pengelly. He had stored a box of secondary, less critical reference samples in the vestibule of the Cornishman's strange iron house, telling him he needed a place safe from animals. His real reason was that he believed the thermal mass of the iron would, if nothing else, create a stable, if cold, temperature. He now realized it might be the only place in the entire county that wasn't frozen solid. He bundled himself in his heaviest clothes and began the half-mile trek up the trail. The cold was a physical thing. The air was so dense it seemed to resist his movement. His breath froze instantly on his scarf, and the hairs in his nostrils turned to tiny needles of ice. The world was silent, save for the squeaking crunch of his boots on the dry, packed snow. He saw the two black cylinders ahead, a thin ribbon of smoke rising perfectly straight from the stovepipe into the still air. It looked like a machine, not a home. He steeled himself for the biting cold he expected to find inside the iron structure. He reached the vestibule and pulled on the heavy outer door. It swung open smoothly, without a hint of being frozen shut. He stepped inside the small wooden space and pulled the door closed behind him. He was now in the airlock between the outside world and the living space. He reached for the inner door, his mind braced for the damp, metallic chill he had predicted for months. He opened the door, and the vindication was not a sight or a sound. It was a physical force, a wave of warmth so profound and absolute it felt like stepping into a summer afternoon, washed over him. It hit his face first, melting the frost from his eyebrows. He took a half step forward, his head and shoulders clearing the doorway, and stopped, stunned into silence. He hadn't even fully entered the room, and he was already warmer than he had been all week standing beside his own stove. He stepped fully inside, closing the door behind him. The air was warm, still, and smelled faintly of baking bread and wood smoke. Trevenen Pengelly sat at a table, sharpening a tool. The children were playing quietly on the floor. Morwenna offered him a nod from beside the stove. Fenimore's eyes darted around the room, taking in the impossible scene. No frost on the walls, no frantic fire in the stove, just a calm, quiet, warm domesticity that felt like a miracle. Then his gaze fell on the desk. He saw the inkwells. He walked over to them, as if in a trance. He reached out a gloved hand and picked one up. He tilted it. The black ink swirled, dark and fluid. He stared at it for a long moment, the entire arrogant structure of his certainty dissolving in the face of this simple, undeniable proof. He looked at Trevenen, who had stopped his work and was watching him with a neutral expression. Fenimore's face, a mask of professional pride, drained of all its color. He set the inkwell down carefully. "How?" Fenimore asked, his voice barely a whisper. Trevenen gestured to the curved wall. "The seams don't leak." Fenimore shook his head, looking around the space, finally understanding the radical genius of the design. He saw it not as walls and a roof, but as a single, integrated object. "My God, Pengelly," he said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect. "You didn't build a house. You built a hull against the deep." Asher Fenimore became Trevenen Pengelly's most fervent advocate. When the inversion finally broke and the valley thawed, the stories of suffering were everywhere. But the story that traveled fastest was Fenimore's account of the warm iron house on the hill, of the liquid ink in a world of ice. He went directly to the mine supervisor, a practical man named Coulthard, and explained the physics of the sealed envelope with the passion of a new convert. Coulthard, who had lost a week of productivity because his offices were uninhabitable, was convinced. The syndicate immediately commissioned Pengelly to build 2 smaller versions of his design to serve as line shacks for the crews working the high country claims. They would be used as warming stations and emergency shelters. Pengelly was paid handsomely, and more importantly, his design was given the syndicate's official seal of approval. The idea spread not through newspapers or architectural plans, but through the itinerant workforce of the mining camps. Rivet crews, who moved from mine to mine repairing boilers and ore carts, saw Pengelly's design and understood its logic immediately. It was their own trade, applied to a new problem. They took the basic pattern, the double skin, the sawdust fill, the sealed vestibule, and carried it with them. By the end of the decade, Cornish houses, or boiler houses, could be found dotted throughout the mining districts, from the Coeur d'Alene up to Wallace and into the Slocan Valley of British Columbia. Each one was a testament to the quiet genius of the man who had looked at a winter house and seen a high-pressure boiler. The principles that Trevenen Pengelly demonstrated in 1894 are now cornerstones of modern building science. His obsession with a sealed envelope anticipated the concept of airtight construction, which is now a primary goal in high-efficiency building. Today, we use blower door tests to measure a home's air changes per hour, striving for the low numbers Pengelly achieved by instinct and experience. His double-wall, insulated construction is a direct ancestor of the super-insulated walls found in passive house design, the most rigorous energy efficiency standard in the world. He was, without knowing it, a century ahead of his time, proving a fundamental truth on a cold Idaho hillside. The battle for warmth is won not by making more heat, but by losing less of it. In the end, the story of Trevenen Pengelly is a story about the power of the right metaphor. The frontiersmen who built the leaky log cabins saw their homes as fortresses, as walls to stand against the wind. Their metaphor was one of conflict, of bracing against an attack. But Pengelly, the boilermaker from Cornwall, had a different metaphor, one born from his trade. He didn't build walls, he built a vessel. He understood that the vast, crushing cold of winter was not an army to be fought, but an ocean to be navigated. It was a medium of immense and constant pressure. And you do not fight the pressure of the deep with porous walls and hopeful chinking. You meet it with a sealed, integral hull, designed not to fight the pressure, but to be indifferent to it. He built a shelter that did not struggle against the winter. It simply floated, warm and secure, in its cold, silent depths. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more explorations of forgotten knowledge. And tell us in the comments, what modern technology do you think was secretly invented by a pioneer long ago? Disclaimer. This video presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical building practices and principles of thermodynamics. The characters, names, and specific events are created for storytelling purposes. The techniques described are based on real historical precedents, but should not be attempted without consulting modern building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering advice. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional guidance.